Chapter 18. Mud pressed himself against the back of the tall bookshelf and watched the lantern light flit between the books. The man and woman split up, the woman walking along the front of the room, checking each aisle, while the man rushed to the back. Mud's heart beat in time with the man's heavy footsteps. The woman's lighter steps scraped against the marble floor to Mud's other side. It wouldn't be long before they came even with the aisle where he hid and saw him. They had him trapped between them, with nowhere to run. Mud crouched down and silently pulled a set of heavy books off the bottom shelf. He stacked them on the edge of the shelf above, then waited. Thump, thump, the man's lantern lit up the back wall and cast wavering shadows on the scrolls. Scrape. The woman neared from the front of the room. A few more steps and they both reached the aisle where Mud crouched. Mud licked his lips. Light filled the aisle just before his. Then it dimmed as the two aesthetics took the step past the ends of the bookshelves. In that heartbeat, Mud dived through the small hole he'd made at the bottom of the shelf and rolled into the aisle they'd already passed. He leaped to his feet and ran for the door, grateful for the times he spent creeping about Potter's Mill, where he learned to run quickly and quietly. He kept to the dark shadows cast by the lanterns on the other side of the bookshelf. Reaching the door, he swung out into the hall and rushed back toward the room with the bats. Once inside, he closed the door and took a deep breath. The smell of the lime in the air burned his lungs. He coughed, and the ragged sound echoed through the silent building. He pressed his hand over his mouth and rushed out the library, taking only a moment to relock the door and shut it behind him. The ancient trees stood sentinel outside. He slid behind a thick trunk, gasping for breath. The scent of rain hung on the air, and clouds that had not been there before billowed in the sky above him. Dread filled him. He'd failed to find anything that would lead him to the door. He imagined Sonara, injured and hurting, imprisoned by the hungry red dragon. How long would she last against such a powerful dragon? How would he ever figure this out in time? Mud made his way back up the street. The bitter taste of the lime stayed with him. A drop of water hit his nose, followed by several more. With a clap of thunder, the clouds opened up and poured sheets of rain down on him. He ran for the inn. Footsteps echoed behind him. He glanced over his shoulder, but could see nothing through the blinding rain. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, and he ran faster. Hera met him at the inn's door. "Where have you been?" she demanded. Mud slid inside and closed the door, wiping the water out of his eyes. "I went to the library to see if I could find what we needed." His teeth chattered from the cold and wet. "You snuck in there?" Hera's shrill voice echoed through the common room. "Shh!" Mud pressed his hand over her mouth and pulled her upstairs. They reached her room before he released her. "You should have told me," Hera said. "I've been worried sick." "You should be asleep," Mud said. "It was my half of the night to keep an eye on Drake Cutter. Have you forgotten about that little problem?" Hera shoved a towel into Mud's hands. "No, I haven't," Mud said, rubbing the towel over his dripping hair and clothes. "That's why you had your own room, with a lock on the door." He turned to go to his room, but Hera stopped him with a hand on his arm. "Did you find anything?" she asked. That was the question Mud was dreading. He'd hoped to slip back in without anyone noticing, so he'd never have to admit his defeat at the library. "No, I didn't learn what we needed," Mud said. "The library is too big. We could read through books for 100 years and never find it. I think Drake Cutter had the right idea. We have to hunt the red dragon and rescue Samara ourselves." Hera didn't say anything for a moment. Water dripped from Mud's clothes and formed a puddle at his feet, despite his best efforts with the flimsy towel. Hera frowned. "The aesthetics know the library well. They could guide us to a likely section of books that would only take us a short time to find mention of the pendant. Except the aesthetics won't let us in, remember?" Mud said. "We'll just have to try again in the morning. I'm sure the aesthetics can be reasoned with. A little bit of cleaning shouldn't be an excuse to close the whole library, especially for something as important as this." Hera patted his back and let him go. Mud stalked into his own room and shut the door. Sunlight shining through the window woke Mud the next morning. Irridan was already up, kneeling in the shaft of light with his head bowed and the medallion clutched in his little hands. He wore the new clothing Hera had gotten him, but with an air of discomfort Mud couldn't miss. Mud slipped into his clothes, which he laid out by the fire to dry before going to sleep. Then he shook Drake Cutter awake. Drake Cutter snorted and slapped Mud away. Hera stepped into the room, already dressed, holding her red comb in her hand. Iridan stood and gave her a graceful bow that would have looked regal if he were a bit taller and dressed in robes. "You look well," Hera said. "If we get a few more meals into you, you'll be as good as ever. Here." She held out her comb to Iridan. Iridan touched his tangled mop of hair and flushed with embarrassment. Mud grinned, gave Draycutter one more nudge, then headed downstairs to see about breakfast. The others came down just after Mud had finished his second helping of sausage and eggs, claiming its seats at the long table beside him. The room bustled with activity. The innkeeper's pretty daughters carried out plates of food and saw to the guests' needs. A blazing fire crackled in the fireplace. The chatter of conversation filled the room. At one table, 3 fair-skinned Sylvanesti elves whispered to each other, ignoring everyone else in the room. Their faces were narrow, almost delicate, and long pointed ears picked out from beneath their golden hair. Not far from them, a table full of visiting merchants argued about acceptable pricings of their rares and preferred market locations. The lone man Mud had seen by the fire the night before sat at a table as close to the warmth as he could get. From deep beneath his hood his eyes darted about the room. His hands rested on one of his 2 sword hilts. As Mud mopped up more eggs with a bit of toast, the man pulled open a scroll case and drew forth a single sheet of parchment. This he held and studied with care. Mud put a guilty hand in his pocket, where he carelessly folded and shoved Shamara's drawing of the door. The innkeeper stepped into the common room, holding a sealed letter. "Iridan, Jalastin, and Eladorian," he called out, heading for the elves. The elves looked up in surprise, and each shook its head. Iridan jumped to his feet and strolled across the room, a tiny skeletal figure lost in the press of larger buildings. "Eladorian," the innkeeper called out again. "Is there anyone here by the name of Iridan Eladorian?" "Here!" Iridan's shrill voice cut through the chatter in the room. He reached up to take the letter. "I'm Iridan. May I have that, please?" The innkeeper frowned at Iridan and had hold of the letter. "Don't be ridiculous. Iridan is a Sylvanesti name, and this was just brought by an acolyte from the Temple of Paladine. It's sealed by Reverend Son Elliston himself." "Yes, I've been expecting it," Iridan said, drawing himself up to his full diminutive height. Mud jumped to his feet and crossed the room. "The Kender is Iridan," Mud told the innkeeper, "and I was with him yesterday when the cleric said they would take his petition to Elliston. The letter is for him." The innkeeper let out an exasperated breath and handed the letter to Iridan. "Wait!" One of the elves stepped forward, his brow raised. "This Kender is not Iridan. He should be thrown in prison for such an outrageous lie. Erlis Calastis Iridan is great leader of Sylvanesti House cleric. Iridan is his son." Iridan's face turned scarlet and his hand shook on the letter. He looked like he might say something, but instead he darted away through the common room and back up the stairs. Mud shrugged. "He's a bit addled. Think he's a cleric of Paladine. Told the priest his name is Iridan. I'm sure Reverend Son Elliston knows better, and has taken that into account in his letter." The elf returned to his table, giving Mud a skeptical look. Mud started after Iridan and found Hera and Draycutter right beside him. "Poor Iridan," Hera said. "We better go make sure he's all right." Mud led the way upstairs to their room. They found Iridan sitting at the table with the open letter crumpled in his hand. Moisture glinted at the edge of his eyes. Hera rushed over to him. "What does it say, Iridan? What's wrong?" Iridan shook his head, unable to speak. Mud pried the crumpled letter from his fingers, smoothed it, and read it out loud. "Dear Iridan, I'm alarmed to hear of your present circumstances, and have spent all night in prayer to Paladine on your behalf. If you return to the temple, I'll see that you are welcomed as you deserved. However, my prayers have led me to believe that the answer to your distress cannot be found here. Paladine has consecrated you in service to others who are in need of your skills. Paladine's blessing and my own go with you on whatever road you are called to follow. Reverend Son Elliston." "What present circumstances?" Hera whispered. Iridan stood, shaking. "I'm cursed, thrust down into this vile little body, expelled from Sylvanesti's society, misused, misbelieved, and mishandled, forced to beg for scraps of food because I'm not truly a lying little thief of a Kender. I'm a Sylvanesti elf of House Cleric. My great skills in history, writing, translation, and healing go unused and unwanted because no one believes Kender are worth anything at all. Reverend Son Elliston was my last hope. Now I have nothing." Hera knelt and wrapped her arms around Iridan. You have us, and I don't believe Kinder really set out to lie or steal. Things just happened. Eridan struggled out of her gas. You don't believe me. I really am Eridan Elaine. Just because I don't look like an elf, you think I can't possibly be one. Mud took a deep breath. Perhaps you'd like to tell us how you became a Kender. End of chapter 18.